Just before I start off, I just want to sort of really re-endorse some opening comments from Colin, then reinforced again by Andrew, and that is this whole area of the work that is done in the biosecurity area. It's one thing to look at the import and the product coming into Australia, which is very, very obvious, and it's the one that sort of hits us in the face. But it's incredibly, and I'll just put some numbers up, I'll only sort of park on it for about 30 or 40 seconds, but particularly for the Australian grains industry and for agriculture in general, the importance of getting product out of Australia. It's just absolutely critical. Okay, and so look, just on that first slide, the reliance on export markets for the Australian grains industry, and they're just the major ones. Wheat, coarse grain, oilseed. So this is just running off the ABARES numbers, the current, or I think they're a couple of weeks old now, but they're very, very close to the current ABARES numbers. But we're looking at about 45 million tonnes of product, of which just over 30 million tonnes is export. So that's 70% of Australia's grain exports are reliant on getting to an overseas destination, and not one tonne of that 31 million tonnes would go anywhere without the work of what is now called DAF Biosecurity. I really want to sort of make that point, not one tonne, because it's all going to countries that that come under the International Plant Protection Convention. So each of the major importing and exporting countries, and there's 177 of them, have what are called a National Plant Protection Organisation. In Australia, the National Plant Protection Organisation was called ABARES, it's now called DAF Biosecurity, and the various National Plant Protection Organisations come under, they abide by the conventions and the protocols established by the International Plant Protection Convention, which is a UN, run by a UN Secretariat. And that particular convention lays out the processes, the protocols, for countries that are exporting product and the countries that are importing product. Okay, this is how it's going to be done. This is how we're going to determine seeds and numbers and all of those sorts of aspects. But once again, it's just absolutely critical that anything that happens within from an Australian grains industry context, and particularly, obviously for product going out of Australia, those protocols have to fall in line with the International Plant Protection Convention. Now, where this all comes from is, and Andrew just did mention it, and talked about the Beale report, what is commonly called the Beale report, and that was called One Biosecurity, a Working Partnership. And this came out of in the mid-2000s, we had the equine influenza outbreak in Australia. The government commissioned a report and looked into how ABARES, as it was, how ABARES related to its key stakeholders, whether those key stakeholders be importers or exporters. In the grains industry case, we're key exporters, and what the federal government did was there was a number of recommendations that came out of the Beale report, and the federal government adopted the Beale report in its, I think, pretty much in its entirety. I might be incorrect there, but my take on that was they did take it in its entirety, and what they implemented, they said, okay, if we're going to be serious about this, let's have a good look at that interface between ABARES and its key stakeholders, the people who are either bringing product into Australia or, in particularly the grains industry's case, taking product out of Australia, because it is just absolutely critical that any improvement in that interface is going to have commercial implications, and those commercial implications can be positive or they can be negative. And obviously what we wanted to do was take those recommendations and turn them into positive commercial implications. Abiding by, and I can't stress this enough, abiding by the implications that are in the International Plant Protection Convention. Absolutely critical that that occurred. So the federal government, under the then Minister, Tony Burke, put in place, they put funding towards various reform packages. And they just called it the Export Certification Reform Package. This is for just looking at agriculture, and they put in place various ministerial task forces: grain, meat, live animals, dairy, seafood, and horticulture. And of course, I'll be talking about the experiences and the outcomes of the Australian grains industry in relation to those task forces. Okay, I don't want all I want to do was to throw up the names of the people associated with that, because it really was an industry-wide ministerial task force. There was, and all sectors were represented all the way through. So it was so right through from the production sector, right through the various commodity groups, right through the various trade associations, all the way to export, major exporters, etc. But the other important thing about this MTF it wasn't just a bunch of commercial people sitting around a table, it was also all the people from ABARES. And so you had the grain export program in there, and they did a marvellous job in that interface, and it was one of the things, the real benefits that came out, I'll have a bit more to say about that, that really came out of this whole program was the interface between industry and the government through the members of the grain export program within what was then ABARES. Okay, so under the reform package, the grain export reform package, we looked at 6 key areas, and I just want to very, very briefly, and obviously it's a time constraint, just touch on what those key areas key areas were. And the first one was we looked at the legislation. The current legislation was about 140 pages. Does that current legislation, or it has been since changed, but was the legislation that was in place at the time, does that reflect commercial reality? Is it contemporary? Does it aid, and I know this sounds like a hackneyed phrase, but you just have to keep going back to it, does it facilitate trade? And if it's the grains industry, you have to facilitate trade. We're not going to turn our backs on 30 million tonnes, $8 billion worth of product, about $8.5 billion worth of product that goes out of Australia each year. So the thing was, what we wanted to do was, when we looked at that legislation, we compared it to legislation overseas. We wanted to make it less prescriptive and simplified. You know, within the current legislation, or within the legislation as it was, you know, it had numbers in there, it had percentages. And so if something changed within the commercial world, you had to change the legislation. To change the legislation, or the orders more correctly, you had to go up to the minister and get the minister to sign off. Now that process may be quite quick, it might take some weeks or even months, in which time the international marketplace, the global grain trade has moved on. Okay, so we wanted to sort of be able to reflect that in the legislation. So we had at what were the export control orders for 2005, they were reviewed, and the hay and straw, and I should have mentioned, within this particular program, seeds, fodder, nuts also came under the bailiwick of grains, but not horticulture. So we had those 2 sets of orders. They were both combined into the export control order of 2011. We went from 140 pages down to 40 pages, but we didn't sacrifice anything, and I can't stress this enough, we didn't sacrifice anything in terms of being able to abide by the International Plant Protection Convention. So the prescription, you know, the percentages, they were taken out and they were put into what are now the Plant Export Operations Manual. So they can be changed within the Grains Industry Consultative Committee, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that. We now have less reliance on endpoint inspection, and I'll mention that again in a minute. But instead of the product being literally inspected as it goes onto the boat, we now have what is in place called a shipping bin concept. And that has been a major change to the way the industry operates. We've obviously, all of that, it leads to increased flexibility for both ourselves and, as I've already mentioned, we align ourselves with the provisions of the International Plant Protection Convention. The second thing that we looked at was the operation and inspection aspects, and I should say over on the right-hand side there you see the Bill recommendation column. So these were, you know, if anybody wants to dive into Bill, go to recommendation 65 and there'll be a reference there to inspection, and likewise on the legislation. So what we had to do was align ourselves to obviously the Bill report. And what we wanted to come up with was a world-class operating framework, and I believe we've got that now. So, a little bit too quick. So the first thing that came into play was inspection up till now has been done by the ABARES officers. And so we now have in place what are called authorised officers, and I'll have a little bit more to say about authorised officers in a minute. But those people, they may be employed, they may be government employees, but they may come from industry, or they may be a third party as well. So once again, this flexibility coming into the system. DAF Biosecurity are going to provide the training, certification and audit procedures. So that is very, very firmly embedded there. The shipping bin inspection. I mentioned about endpoint inspections. Now, up till fairly recently, the only way that product was inspected was as it was leaving Australia. So as it was being loaded onto the ship, as it was being put into the container. If I can particularly just talk about the inspection, and for the inspection that we're talking about live insects in particular, live grain insects. The inspection was being done or is being done as it's being loaded onto the ship. So you might be halfway through loading 30,000 tonnes. You've got 15,000 tonnes onto a ship, and then there's a live insect detected. It only requires one, because we have a nil tolerance to live insects. The whole thing comes to a crashing halt. What are we going to do with that product that's already on the ship? We're going to take it off the ship and refumigate it, in which case we have to treat it as product coming into Australia and go through the import protocols. What are we going to do with the product that's out in the bins behind us? And we've got a ship there that just depending on what shipping freight rates are, etc., but it might be incurring demurrage at $10,000, $20,000 per day. Enormous costs can come out of something like that. So what we have now is a shipping bin concept. So once again, we have to put the processes in place on the various ports around Australia, etc., but the inspection is carried out as the product comes into a bin. And once the inspector has signed off that the product that has come into that bin, which is, to use the term, sort of quarantined within that bin, that is insect-free, that can be loaded straight onto the ship. We're not going to have demurrage issues. So once again, incredible flexibility there, and a very, very sound and defendable position, but very commercially astute. And the same sort of thing with product going into containers. This was a major reform, as you can sort of certainly imagine. The vessel inspection by AOs. Currently, through occupational and health and safety, I keep saying ABARES. It's DAF Biosecurity. I'm not quite sure why you would scrap the name ABARES when it was so well known, but I won't go there. But my only comment there would be, ABARES, Australian Quarantine Inspection Service, it really says what it does, internationally recognised, highly credible, and it's now been changed to DAF Biosecurity. I'm a little bit concerned if we have a change of government, or Julia has a ministerial reshuffle and fisheries and forestries goes somewhere else, that it becomes DAG Biosecurity. But anyway, what currently occurs with product going out of Australia is within the ships, there's two surveys that are conducted. One's a marine survey, and that is to make sure that the ship's seaworthy. The other is the inspection to ensure that from a quarantine perspective, the DAF Biosecurity people will go through and also make sure that there's no live insects, flaking paint, odours, things such as that. So two surveys have to be done. The marine surveyors are quite happy to do that offshore. The ABARES survey has to be done alongside, and that's an occupational health and safety issue. What we're now put in place is for the marine surveyors to be accredited to become the biosecurity inspectors as well. So the survey for that can be done offshore, and all you need to do is go off, if anybody ever goes for a bit of a drive, well, off the port of somewhere like Newcastle, and you see all these ships out there, pounds of peanuts, some of them are will be loading grain, and once again, instead of the ship coming alongside, and then failing survey for the certification inspection, or the phytosanitary inspection more correctly, if there is an issue, that can be dealt with before it comes alongside.